Well, hello, Andrew here again, and today we're looking at episode 91, and this one is entitled The Complicity of Silence. What I'm doing today is I'm picking up the same theme as yesterday. It might have seemed a bit thin, but I was doing a bit of research for that, looking through into the Old Testament and particularly into the book of Numbers, and I noticed something, so I want to actually do a segue from where we were yesterday and to talk about some other issues. And so we pick up the text that we had yesterday just to give us a sense of where we're leaping off from. Matthew chapter 5 verses 33 to 37. Again, you have heard that it was said of those ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows that you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. Now, as I said, I want to have a look into the Old Testament, because as I was looking at this, particularly in Numbers chapter 30, it struck me that there were some other issues here that are worth actually looking at and considering. So I'm going to read to you chapter 30, it's 16 verses, and I just want you to notice what you notice. And then I'll tell you what I've noticed, and you can kind of compare notes with me. Numbers chapter 30 verse 1. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, this is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said. So that's the bit about oath keeping. Now, here we come to the interesting bit. When a young woman still living in her father's house makes a vow to the Lord or obligates herself by a pledge, and her father hears about her vow or pledge, but says nothing to her, then all her vows and every pledge by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her father forbids her, when he hears about it, none of her vows or pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. The Lord will release her because her father has forbidden her. Ooh. Verse 6, if she marries after she makes a vow, or her lips utter a rash promise by which she obligates herself, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her, then her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband forbids her when he hears about it, he nullifies the vow that obligates her or the rash promise by which she obligates herself, and the Lord will release her. Any vow or obligation taken by a widow or divorced woman will be binding on her. If a woman living with her husband makes a vow or obligates herself by a pledge under oath, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her and does not forbid her, then all her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband nullifies them when he hears about them, then none of the vows or pledges that came from her lips will stand. Her husband has nullified them, and the Lord will release her. Her husband may confirm or nullify any vow she makes or any sworn pledge to deny herself. But if her husband says nothing to her about it from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or the pledges binding on her. He confirms them by saying nothing to her when he hears about them. If, however, he nullifies them sometime after he hears about them, then he is responsible for her guilt. These are the regulations the Lord gave Moses concerning relationships between a man and his wife, and between a father and his young daughter still living in his house. Now you may hear that and you may be outraged. You may be thinking, how patronizing, how terrible. And yes, at one level it is. We don't live in those days anymore. It was in days when women are clearly treated as property. It was a sign of the times. And yet I want to suggest it may well and almost certainly was a step forward in their day. The reality is that women were uneducated. They weren't considered needing education. They weren't worth education. Why would you put resources into someone whose job is simply to look after the house and have babies? Seriously? That's how they saw it. So the women weren't educated, and they weren't expected to lead or to make decisions. And it was felt that they could be taken advantage of and needed to be protected from themselves as much as anything else. Patronising, we may say, yes, but a step forward, nevertheless, in their own day. And in case we think we've moved forward since then, 3,000 years ago, maybe 4, since this law was given, in case we have moved forward a long way, I remember that in my own lifetime, which has been still relatively short, women were not able to buy houses or take out mortgages on their own. Seriously, that's the case as it was when I was growing up. It was very hard for a young woman to actually be able to get a mortgage and to buy a house, to show that she was independent and had the capacity to be able to do that. We haven't moved that far that quickly. We're still getting with the program. But there's something else that I wanted to talk about, to point out, that I think speaks to us today. I don't know if you noticed it, but what we read in all those examples is that silence is not a defense. That to say nothing actually makes you complicit. That if the man in any of these cases said nothing, he was giving complicit agreement to the oath that the woman had taken. He was standing by the oath. He was supporting the oath because he said nothing. And that, I think, raises some interesting questions for us in our day. Is our silence on so many issues a form of complicity? I think it's very challenging. And I may be judged, our generation may be judged, people in my privileged position may be judged as future generations look back upon us and say, well, we recognise it's very challenging, but if we see an injustice and remain silent, are we saying that it's okay? It may be that the Old Testament is more enlightened than we are. If we maintain opposition in silence and we say nothing, we're effectively agreeing that cowardice, and it usually is cowardice, has gotten the better of us. We can see this writ large in American politics at the moment, particularly with members of the Republican Party in both the Senate and in the House, who don't dare say anything critical of the President, who don't dare call him out on his abusiveness, on his injustice, on his racism, on all the so many things that he does which are just plain wrong, simply because they're scared that it means they won't get re-elected. And reality is that they probably won't. The reality also is that they're now at such a tipping point that they may not get re-elected anyway. Scripture is clear in its judgment of the one who sees injustice and does nothing. I want to read some text, so this will just take a few minutes, but just so that you get the picture, here's Proverbs 24 verses 11 and 12. Rescue those being led away to death. Hold back those staggering towards slaughter. If you say, but we knew nothing about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know it? Will he not repay each person according to what he's done? You may claim that you've seen nothing. You may be able to justify that, but the Lord knows. The Lord knows whether you did or whether you didn't. He knows what you've seen and heard and know. And although you may be able to claim realistically that you didn't, He knows whether you did or not. Proverbs 31 verse 8. Speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. There's a clear obligation being put on here. Psalm 82 verses 1 through 4. God presides in the great assembly. He gives judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the cause of the weak and fatherless. Maintain the rights of the poor and oppressed. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And here's a long one, Isaiah 58. Shout it aloud. This is verse 1. Do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the house of Jacob their sin. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and does not forsake the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarrelling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for a person to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and to turn away from your own flesh and to not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. There you are. And those were primitive times. I repeat what I said earlier. What does this all have to say to us today? Our silence on so many issues is complicity. I own that for myself. I find it very challenging. If we see an injustice and remain silent, are we being complicit? It may be that the Old Testament, that these 4,000-year-old words are more enlightened than we are. We maintain justice in silence. We say nothing. As I said, cowardice so often gets the better part of us. Scripture is very clear in its judgment on the one who sees injustice and does nothing. And all this from a discussion on the swearing of oaths. And we think we live in enlightened times. We may still have some catching up to do.